The anchor and chain was a specialized kind of purgatory. It was the last stop before the mainland swallowed you whole, situated just across the choked arteries of the highway leading out from Naval Base San Diego. The air inside wasn't just humid. It was saturated with the regret of 1,000 short-term deployments, the stale scent of spilled Keystone Light, and the sharp, coppery tang of ambition that had been drinking since noon. Every surface, the pitted mahogany bar, the cracked vinyl booths, felt sticky with synthetic loyalty and mandatory camaraderie. This was the domain of the commissioned and the cocky, a place where stripes meant more than service and rank was a ticket to noise. Sergeant Santos, however, was a glitch in the algorithm. She occupied a small, forgotten booth in the back, tucked behind a structural column that seemed to be actively trying to shed its paint. At 38, she possessed the gift of operational invisibility. She was drinking water slowly and reading a dog-eared copy of a forgotten Cold War geopolitical analysis. Her appearance was meticulously bland. Dark, utilitarian clothes, hair pulled back into a severe, functional knot, and a pair of utterly anonymous, thick-rimmed reading glasses that softened the predatory geometry of her face. She was, to everyone in that room, the nanny waiting for her ride, the graduate student trying to cram for an exam, or perhaps the civilian contractor who had wandered into the wrong sector of the complex. She was a zero. She generated no thermal signature. The noise reached its crescendo around 8 p.m., coinciding with the arrival of Lieutenant Commander Reese. Reese was a masterpiece of entitled mediocrity. He wore his summer whites like a costume, perfectly starched, perfectly arrogant. He was loud not because he had to be, but because he believed silence was a betrayal of his status. Tonight, he was holding court with 3 junior officers and a pair of loud, off-duty chiefs, describing, in excruciating detail, his latest victory over the bureaucratic imbeciles in logistics. His voice, amplified by 3 IPAs too many, cut through the din like a high-tension wire snapping. Santos did not look up. Her breathing remained steady. A practiced 4-count inhale and 6-count exhale, the internal rhythm of someone who views the external world as a series of solvable vector problems. Reese's problem was spatial awareness, or rather, the profound belief that the space he occupied expanded relative to his rank. As he dramatically pivoted to demonstrate the incompetence of the supply chain specialist he had just verbally eviscerated, his elbow caught the edge of Santos's small circular table. It was not a graze. It was an impact. Her glass of water did not simply tip, it launched, tracing a high, slow arc before splashing directly across the pristine front of Reese's uniform blouse, momentarily drenching the gold leaf on his shoulder boards. The immediate silence was astonishing. It was the kind of silence that happens only when something truly expensive has been broken, or when hierarchy has been violently inverted. The entire bar froze, witnessing the sacrilege. Reese stopped mid-sentence. His face, ruddy from alcohol and self-importance, instantly tightened into a mask of wounded dignity. He didn't see a person. He saw an obstacle, an insult to the uniform. "Are you completely blind, ma'am?" Reese demanded, the use of ma'am dripping with aggressive condescension. He didn't wait for an answer. He took a heavy step toward the booth, looming over the woman who dared to sit in his light. "Look at this. This is regulation issue, dry cleaned this morning. You just ruined several $100s of professional attire because you were sitting there like a goddamn statue." His voice was gaining altitude, feeding off the attention. The junior officers behind him managed various expressions of shocked sympathy for their superior, reinforcing the narrative that the invisible woman was criminally incompetent. Santos finally, deliberately, closed her paperback. She placed a thin, custom-made bookmark between the pages, a strip of carbon fiber, matte black. Her hands moved with the precision of a jeweler or a bomb technician. The slight, almost imperceptible thwack of the book closing was, in the sudden quiet, deafening. She did not flinch, apologize, or widen her eyes in fear, which were Reese's expected parameters for a civilian in the presence of an injured officer. Instead, her focus became absolute. She took off the reading glasses. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Without the diffusion of the thick lenses, her eyes, a startling colorless gray, were revealed. They were not merely focused, they were calibrated. The cold look, the result of 15 years spent viewing complex human scenarios through the lens of threat assessment, flashed outward. It was the look of a sniper sighting through glass, the gaze that doesn't see emotion, only structural weakness and opportunity. My apologies, Commander, Santos said, her voice a low contralto, perfectly even, entirely devoid of stress or apology. It was purely informational. I was stationary. You violated my personal operating envelope. Reese laughed, a short, explosive burst of contempt. Your operating envelope? Are you serious? You're reading a book in a bar, lady. Get up. You need to come with me and give the bartender your information so I can get this handled. Now. He reached for her. This was the moment of physical assertion he required to re-establish dominance for his subordinates. He planned to grab her forearm, hoist her out of the booth, and steer her toward the bar, demonstrating to his audience that rank dictates movement. This was his final mistake. His hand, large and soft from years of delegated labor, closed around her wrist. He intended a pull, a jerk upward. But the moment his fingers made contact, Santos's entire disposition changed from stillness to instantaneous, devastating economy of motion. It was a movement so small, so deceptively minor, that most of the observers missed the mechanical causality. It began with a subtle internal rotation of her ulna. Her elbow remained locked to her side, but her hand, which Reese thought he was controlling, instantly generated leverage against the natural bend of his wrist. She didn't fight the grip. She inverted it. Reese felt a sudden, agonizing pressure that seemed to originate not from the external force of her hand, but from the deep, sensitive median nerve running through the core of his arm. It wasn't raw strength. It was physics applied to vulnerability. His hand instantly went numb, his grip dissolving into a useless spasm of fear. He tried to pull back, but found his wrists locked in a grip that felt like polished granite, held by a woman who looked like a school librarian. He was rooted to the spot. His posture suddenly bent into a painfully awkward, low-level joint lock. His initial reaction was shock, then anger, then the realization that the pain was immediate and rapidly escalating. If she rotated her wrist another quarter inch, the radius would crack. "Let go of me, you crazy bitch," he hissed, his voice dropping sharply from drunken bravado to panicked secrecy. Santos leaned in, her gray eyes inches from his, utterly flat. The smell of cheap beer and fear mixed around them. She did not raise her voice. She did not move her head. She spoke into the narrow space between their ears. A sound meant only for him. A sound that carried the weight of unmarked graves and classified directives. "Lieutenant Commander Reese," she whispered, her voice colder than deep ocean trenches. "You need to release my arm now, and then you need to forget you ever saw me." He was still resisting the pain, trying to use his superior size. Santos applied the smallest micro-correction, a millimeter of torque. Reese gasped, a choked, involuntary noise of utter agony. His eyes went wide, swimming in panic. Then she delivered the payload. The word she spoke was a single, low-frequency syllable, a sonic command that obliterated his reality. Viper 1. The color drained from Reese's face faster than water through a sieve. It was an instant, total evacuation of blood and bravado. His skin turned waxy, pale, betraying the severe shock that had just hit his central nervous system. His eyes, moments ago filled with arrogant rage, were now dilated, fixed in pure, distilled terror. He didn't just recognize the phrase, he recognized the gravity of what he had just done. Viper 1 was not a public call sign. It was not a unit designator found in any modern deployment handbook. It was a designation whispered in the deepest parts of Special Operations Command, reserved for a program that officially ceased to exist in 1994. It was the Ghost Rank. The Viper program was an ultra-elite, entirely deniable force comprised almost exclusively of highly specialized non-commissioned officers, NCOs, and enlisted technicians who operated across the globe with authority that superseded the existing military chain of command during specific, critical, high-risk operational windows. A Viper 1 was an operative who possessed full operational autonomy, granted by executive order, and whose mission profile was usually the cleanup or execution of scenarios too politically explosive for standard Tier 1 assets. They were the operational auditors of the shadows, and they were historically NCOs trained to treat a lieutenant commander like a speed bump if he interfered with the mission. Reese had only heard the term once, during a required, highly sanitized security briefing at command school. A single slide, quickly glossed over, showing a black insignia with a stylized snake, followed by a chilling, simple warning. If you encounter a designation associated with this program, step back. Do not engage. Do not question. Immediately comply. The realization was a punch to the soul. He wasn't just dealing with an aggressive civilian. He was holding the wrist of an operational asset who, according to the deep-forgotten doctrine of the military, held the unofficial power of a 3-star general operating off the books. And he had just insulted her, tried to manhandle her, and demanded she apologize for his own clumsiness. Reese's body temperature seemed to plummet. He released her wrist instantly, not by choice, but by reflex of operational survival. His whole arm felt like it had been dunked in ice water. Santos, feeling the release, stepped back half a pace, allowing him his space but maintaining the lethal geometry. She rotated her now free wrist, a calm, casual movement that spoke volumes about her control. The crowd around them, sensing the profound, non-verbal shift in power dynamics, began to nervously shuffle and divert their attention. They didn't know the code, but they understood the seismic shift. The big, loud officer was now a cringing, trembling shadow, staring at the floor with the wide-eyed reverence of a man who just recognized the face of death. One of the chiefs, a man named Henderson who had served 2 decades, caught the look in Reese's eyes. Henderson didn't need the code. He saw the way Santos moved, the way her stance was simultaneously relaxed and anchored, the way her eyes never blinked or shifted focus, always on the threat, never on the noise. Henderson had seen that look before, usually on the faces of people who had been trained to kill in silence. He grabbed the junior officers by the shoulder and murmured, "Drinks are on me at the other end of the bar." Now, he understood the need for isolation. Santos maintained her low whisper, ensuring that the humiliation was intensely private, even while happening in public. "You called me a statue, Commander. You assumed my presence was accidental, irrelevant. You measured my worth by the visibility of my rank, and in doing so, you compromised your own security posture." Reese was struggling to breathe. I apologize. I was out of line. I didn't recognize—" "Of course you didn't." Santos cut him off, her voice laced with dry, surgical contempt. "That's the point of the design. We are the structural integrity you rely on when your visible edifice fails. We are the contingency plan that you are not cleared to know about." She motioned slightly toward her bag, a simple, heavy-duty canvas shoulder bag resting in the corner of the booth. "Inside that bag, Commander," she continued, her gaze boring into him, forcing him to meet her eyes, "I have 3 communications devices, none of which connect to a standard naval grid. I have identification that allows me passage through security zones you require 4 layers of clearance to access. And I have operational certification that means, if I decide your immediate extraction from this environment is necessary for the integrity of an ongoing domestic security protocol, I don't need to ask permission. I just need to file the after-action report." Reese swallowed hard. He knew exactly what she meant. He had seen the rumors about the deep, dark assets, the operatives who carried the history of conflicts the U.S. government denied ever happened. He knew his career, built on a foundation of entitlement and polished brass, could be evaporated by a single quiet phone call from a number he didn't even know existed. The gravity of the situation hit him fully. He had publicly assaulted in front of witnesses an unacknowledged Tier 0 asset. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. The silence of the bar was now palpable, heavy, expectant. Santos leaned back slightly, retrieving her carbon fiber bookmark. She paused, running her thumb along its edge. "Let's discuss the uniform, Lieutenant Commander," she stated, shifting the narrative back to his initial complaint, twisting the knife deep into his wounded pride. "You estimated the cost of the dry cleaning. Let me estimate the cost of my presence here." She lowered her voice again, focusing on the historical weight. "I have not taken shore leave that wasn't mission-related since 2017. My designation, Viper 1, was earned during an operation in the Caucasus, where I maintained the integrity of a 6-man reconnaissance team after all commissioned officers were neutralized. I personally extracted 3 wounded assets and secured intelligence that prevented a major destabilization event that would have cost the lives of 10,000 civilians and initiated a global diplomatic crisis." She paused, letting the scope of her hidden history settle into his mind, contrasting starkly with his grievance about spilled water. "My uniform doesn't get dry cleaned, Commander. It gets burned. My medals are never worn because the citation details are classified above top secret. The time I spend in this booth reading a book is my attempt to remember what stillness feels like, a luxury earned through 5 years of continuous combat deployment that you have only read about in sanitized intelligence summaries." She fixed him with one final crushing look. You measure worth by how loud someone speaks. I measure it by how effective they are in the silence. Today, you mistook exhaustion for laziness and discretion for incompetence. Your error has been noted. She reached down into the canvas bag. Reese flinched violently, expecting a weapon, perhaps a silenced sidearm or an operational blade. Instead, she pulled out a worn black leather wallet. From a hidden internal fold, she extracted a single bill, crisp and new. $100. She placed it slowly on the table, pushing it toward the commander. That is for the dry cleaning, Commander, she stated. Consider it a lesson payment. Now I suggest you take your subordinates, retire for the evening, and spend the next 48 hours reviewing the definition of operational security regarding interactions with unidentified assets in non-permissive environments. She stood up. The movement was fluid, graceful, yet undeniably powerful. The coiled energy of a predator who has decided the threat is neutralized but remains vigilant. She picked up her bag, placing the heavy volume on top. She glanced briefly at the bar counter, catching the eye of the bartender, an ex-Navy Master Chief who ran the bar like a quiet, respectful operation. She gave him a tiny, almost invisible nod, a nod of shared understanding among the functional, the people who actually did the work. The Master Chief nodded back, his eyes acknowledging her silent rank, the weight of her presence. He instinctively reached under the counter and pulled out a clean white napkin, which he brought over and placed gently on the wet stain on Reese's uniform, a gesture of quiet, necessary cleanup. Santos didn't acknowledge Reese again. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and began walking toward the exit. She moved through the recovering crowd with the same effortless anonymity with which she had arrived, a ghost departing the scene of its own execution. Reese stood there, frozen, the $100 bill mocking the ruin of his composure. He didn't dare move, didn't dare speak. His entire understanding of the military hierarchy had been irrevocably shattered by a whispered code and a subtle twist of his wrist. He was left contemplating the terrifying reality. The quiet ones often carry the heaviest weight. The invisible ones are the most dangerous. He looked down at the $100 bill, then at the Master Chief wiping the water from his uniform, a clear gesture of service being rendered to a person who clearly held the superior position, even if that position was officially non-existent. The lesson was complete. He had yelled at the nanny for being lazy, and had only then seen the shadow of the Medal of Honor hidden not in a bag, but in the lethal efficiency of her bearing. The screen focuses on the door swinging shut behind her, the noise of the bar slowly, uncertainly, resuming. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.